Today we're going to start to talk about the Roman Republic. As we talked about in class just the other day, Rome had become a republic. That is, a government where the people chose representatives and those representatives then made governmental decisions. Starting in around 509 BC, the Roman Republic started a policy of expansion. And in order to expand Rome from the boot of Italy and beyond, Rome used their very powerful military. So let's take a second to look at the Roman military. The Roman military was made up of legions, and each legion was made up of about 6,000 men. Each of those men were called a legionnaire, that is a Roman soldier. And the rule in the Roman Republic was that if you owned land, you must serve in the military. The legionnaires were then broken down into centuries, much smaller mobile units made up of around 100 men, hence the word century. These men could march up to 20 miles a day carrying heavy equipment and then were expected to build a camp for the night. This is what a typical legionnaire looked like. In order to be in the military, only Roman citizens could sign up, and they had to be fit, which makes sense because you don't want somebody who is slow and sluggish to be protecting you if you're ever in a battle. They were not allowed to get married. Marriage was seen as like a distraction to what they were expected to do. They had a particular kind of armor that gave them really good protection. Their shield was different than Greek's shields. It was more rectangular but curved around the body, which allowed them to be better protected. In the center was something called a boss, and that was used actually as a weapon in itself. They could use that to hit their enemy. In battle, the first weapon they would use is a special kind of javelin called a pilum. Then they would use their short swords that they carried on their belts and stab from behind the safety of their shields. These guys were very disciplined. They were trained to obey all orders at any time. So as the legions and the centuries went out and expanded Rome's boundaries, they actually treated their people that they conquered really well. And we've talked about this before with Cyrus. And if you treat people that you conquer well, they're less likely to rebel. So by 265 BC, they had conquered pretty much all of Italy. And they allowed the people that they conquered to keep their own government if they helped to fight, and even allowed them to have partial rights, or in some cases citizenship, if they did what they asked them to do. There's a river in northern Italy called the Tiber, and if you lived south of that, you were guaranteed citizenship. If you lived beyond that, but were still controlled by Rome, you were given all of the rights that Romans had, but not technically citizenships. So let's take a look now at some of the wars that occurred as part of Roman expansion. First being the Punic Wars between Carthage and Rome. Carthage was a Phoenician colony in northern Africa, and it was Mediterranean's most wealthiest city at this point in time. They were basically controlling trade throughout the Mediterranean. They were trading things like wine, olives, and olive oil, and other things like that. Now, the Romans wanted to control not just Carthage, but basically the entire Mediterranean Sea. They wanted to make it what they called a Roman lake. And the biggest thing that stood in their way of conquering the entire Mediterranean was Carthage. They interfered with Rome's access to trade along the Mediterranean Sea. So what happens is a series of wars called the Punic Wars. The First Punic War begins in 264 BC, and this is when Carthage starts to take over parts of Sicily. And Sicily is here. It's sort of the island that the boot is kicking. And This worried the Romans when the Carthaginians took over Sicily because they're getting really close to Rome. So the Carthaginians had a really powerful fleet of boats that helped to keep the Romans at bay for quite some time. But eventually the Romans developed a bigger, more powerful navy. And in 241, Rome actually won Sicily. But it doesn't end there. You have the Second Punic War. Now, to understand the Second Punic War, you have to understand the Carthaginian general, a guy by the name of Hannibal. And Hannibal was only 9 years old during the First Punic War, and his dad was part of that. At the age of 9, after Carthage's defeat, his dad made him swear revenge on the Romans. So, in 216 BC, Hannibal comes to power. He's a military general, and he's got a new strategy to try to take back Rome. What he decides to do is, rather than to attack from Carthage and go directly to the boot of Italy, he decides what he's going to do instead is land over here in Spain. And he's going to march his troops, which included not just an army, but military elephants as well, through Gaul, what is present-day France, over the Alps here in the north, and move his way down the boot. He took 50,000 military men, 9,000 cavalry, and 60 elephants to through Spain and into Italy. And he ended up losing about half of them. But he was able to defeat them at Cannae. Now, where Carthage had Hannibal, Rome had a guy by the name of Scipio. He devised a plan to attack Carthage. And what he does is he decides to go on the offensive rather than staying on the defensive as Hannibal attacked. And what this forced Hannibal to do is make a decision. Does he continue to fight Rome, or does he go back and defend Carthage? And he decides to go and defend Carthage. So this forces Hannibal back to Carthage, and there Rome is victorious. But again, it does not end there. You have the Third Punic War. In 149 BC, Rome again attacks Carthage, because in the last Punic War, Rome was victorious, but they were not able to take out Carthage. So Rome attacks Carthage, and Carthage is burned to the ground. They force the Carthaginians into slavery. They even go so far as to pour salt all over the land to make it infertile. And Carthage is now a Roman province. This means you can see from the map here, that by the end of the Punic Wars in 146, the Roman Empire includes the boot of Italy, all that is in pink, and all that eventually will be all that is in orange. So after the wars in Rome, they have dominance over the Mediterranean Sea. This increases their wealth because they're able to trade with more people over a greater area. By 70 BC, they basically control from Spain to Anatolia, pretty much the entire Mediterranean Sea. And as they expand their boundaries, as they go and take people over, this is actually one of the reasons why they become so wealthy, is because by taking people over, they're able to loot and plunder and take what they have. So a lot of their income comes from constantly taking people over. But this also causes problems, because the lower classes, many of whom are unemployed, are underemployed, meaning they don't make much money, or are slaves, and they're not happy about it. You also have a breakdown in the military. As they start to get farther and farther away from the heart of Rome, loyalties start to shift, and we're going to talk about these problems in just a second. So let's start with economic problems. The gap between rich and poor gets wider and wider and wider as the boundaries start to expand. The wealthy are those who own these huge agricultural estates, these huge like plantations. And the poor are the people who work on these estates. By 100 BC, a third of the population are slaves. A third of the population, 1 in every 3 people, are slaves. And those are the types of people that the Roman upper class want to be working on their farms because they're free labor. Small farmers just couldn't compete with these bigger farms, and so they end up selling their farms and move into the cities. When they get to the cities, there's no jobs, so they become unemployed and they become homeless. And what comes out of this is class conflict, rich versus poor. Let's take a look at some of those military problems that we were just talking about. So, as the Romans move away from the heart of Rome and start to expand their empires, the generals start to get more and more powerful. And they recruit people as they expand by promising them land, basically saying, if you come and fight for me, I'll make sure that you get pieces of land. So what starts to happen is these soldiers that are promised land, their loyalty doesn't lie with Rome, but instead lies with the general who promised them land or promised them money. And these generals realize that even though they're technically fighting under the Roman Republic, instead they start fighting basically for themselves, and they use their own, what are essentially their own personal troops, to take over people by force. All of this chaos leads to the rise of the dictators and the end of the republic. This idea of representatives making choices for the people that put them in power, this is no longer. Instead, you get dictators and empires. And that leads us to probably one of the most famous figures in history. By 59 BC, you have the first triumvirate. Tri is a Latin root for 3. So 3 people were in power. Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. This 3-person governing alliance. Caesar and Pompey are put into power because these guys were military leaders. Crassus was one of those upper class patricians who had a lot of money. Caesar, during this time period, was over in Gaul, in present-day France, and he had a lot of military victories there, so he was becoming more and more popular, gaining more and more troops. He actually elects himself consul for 1 year, and then eventually elects himself governor of Gaul, so he's becoming more and more powerful, not in Rome, but in Gaul. And then Crassus dies in battle. Pompey and the Roman Senate order Caesar to come home. They say, bring your troops, you need to come home so that we can figure out what we're going to do, how we're going to fill this 3rd position. So, the problem is that Caesar has a choice to make. If he comes with a full-blown army and crosses the Rubicon, that is a river in northern Italy, that is a sign of war. That is basically Caesar declaring war on Rome. So he has a choice. Do I leave my troops behind and go back to Rome, or do I try to take over all of Rome? And what he does is he crosses the Rubicon. He defies Caesar's orders, and now the term to cross the Rubicon or crossing the Rubicon is sort of a term meaning that you've made a decision that can't be undone. And that's exactly what Caesar did. He made a decision that could not be undone by crossing the Rubicon. He basically has declared war on Rome. So as leader, he actually names himself dictator for life, and he starts to make some reforms, some changes. He grants citizenship to people outside of Italy. Remember that just the people who lived within the boot of Italy were granted citizenship. He now has allowed that for people outside of the peninsula. The Senate is now going to include representatives from outside provinces because these outside people have citizenship. They should also have representation. He set up public works programs. He set up ways for the poor to get land to be able to set up their own farms and try to curb that unemployment. He also set up a new solar calendar called the Julian calendar, which is more like what we use today. Now, Caesar, many people thought that he was becoming more tyrannical, that he wanted to be a king. And this went against the heritage of Rome, the heritage of a republic. So on March 15th, 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated on the floor of the Senate. And he was actually assassinated by two of his friends, Brutus and Cassius. And his famous last line was, "Et tu, Brute," which means "you too, Brutus." Like, really? You're doing this to me too. And from there, civil war breaks out. Today, March 15th is known as the Ides of March. A lot of bad things happen around the 15th of March. With the leadership of Julius Caesar gone, now the Romans are in a place where we need to figure out, okay, what's going to happen next? They're in the middle of a civil war. Things are not looking good. That leads us to the second triumvirate. The second triumvirate was made up of Octavian, who was Caesar's grandnephew, Mark Antony, and Marcus Lepidus. And they basically divided all that was controlled by Rome. And they ruled for about 10 years. Now, Octavian had been taught by his uncle how to be a good leader. And many people did not like Mark Antony. The fact that he had married a Egyptian queen, the famous Cleopatra, many people in Rome did not like that. Now, Egypt was controlled by Rome at this point in time, but they didn't see them as being equals to Romans. And they saw them as being sort of less than, or uncivilized compared to the Romans. So when Antony married Cleopatra, it was a slap in the face to many Romans. So Octavian forced Lepidus to retire, and when Mark Antony married Cleopatra, everything just kind of goes crazy from there. Octavian declares war on Mark Antony and defeats him in a famous battle called Antietam. This is when Antony and Cleopatra commit suicide in order to evade Octavian, because the fear was that if Octavian had found Antony and Cleopatra, that suicide was a better option. There was fear that they would be tortured to death, or Cleopatra could have been raped or sold as a slave. When Antony is now out of the way, that allows for Octavian to become the unchallenged ruler of all of Rome. And he takes the name Augustus Caesar, meaning the exalted one. This means the end of the Republic and the beginning of an empire. Thank you.